Welcome to the Chosson and Kallah Shmooze you wish you had, but never got, part 17. As I've been reminding everybody, the material we're talking about is extremely sensitive. It is something that, in essence, we're not allowed to even talk about publicly. It's supposed to be given over on an individual basis, according to the Mishnah. We're doing this because, frankly, there's a lot worse on the internet, as we all know. And secondly, this really is individually. I'm talking only to you, whoever is listening. However, it's very important, aside from listening carefully, it's very important that you listen to the lectures in order, and that means starting from the first one, which is called the Chosson Kallah Shmooze You Wish You Had But Never Got intro. You could Google it. Another way to do it is to Google my YouTube channel and then look for the playlist. The playlist Chosson and Kallah Shmooze starts from the beginning and goes in order. There's also a PDF of much of the material here available. You can email me regarding that. Okay, so we're in the middle of one of the most confounding and confusing areas in halacha, which is what really does the Shulchan Aruch have to say about sexual pleasure? We get conflicting opinions. The conflict actually starts in the Gemara. We saw the Gemara in Nedarim on Chafam and Beis, on 20b in Nedarim. We saw really what amounted to review, and it's important today so we can understand it. We saw basically three opinions. We saw this group of people called the Malachei Asharis, the ministering angels, very lofty, high aspiring, high-level spiritual individuals who understood that the formation of the child was dependent on the purity of the thought of the man and woman who were bonding together, and any extraneous thought at all, somehow or another, could have disastrous, deleterious effects on the spiritual and up to and including the physical development of the child. And then we saw a sort of interlude where they discussed with Rabbi Lazar's wife, Eva Shalom, who had exceedingly notably beautiful children, and they asked her how, and she described their practices, which involved actually many of the same types of abnegations, but without all the dire warnings and consequences. Her main concern was that they should be focusing on each other, and her husband should not have a stray thought about another woman. And so they would engage in it in the middle of the night. And then she uses this phrase, Ke'ilu kaf o shade, as if he was forced by a demon. It's a mysterious phrase. It's hard to know exactly what it means. But Shulchan Aruch brings down a number of different opinions, which all more or less amount to performing the act relatively quickly, limiting pleasure, and that creates a lot of questions because that really does not seem to be the purpose of being sexual together. We have seen it's a mitzvah to be sexual. It's a mitzvah to be sexual even when the possibility of becoming pregnant is not present, such as somebody who's menopausal or somebody who's already pregnant. There's a mitzvah to be sexual. So we have a very interesting opinion over there. It's hard to fully understand what's going on, but it seems to be, at the very least, even within itself, a contradiction, because the idea was for her husband not to have a stray thought. In other words, this union to be successful spiritually is supposed to be a bonding of two individuals who are focusing on each other and not on anything else. And then to understand that it's supposed to be rushed or hurried or in some way limiting pleasure is almost opposite that end, because she didn't say the goal was to limit our pleasure. She said the goal was so that they should be thinking about each other, in essence. So we will come back to that at a later time, maybe today, maybe in a different discussion, because it is important to take that apart. And then the Gemara gives the final opinion, which is basically saying that sexual needs and wishes and desires within the context of a marriage is a non-moral issue, just like some people like their food cooked one way or cooked another. Some like it spicy, some like it sweet. Well, that's how people can engage sexually within a marriage, meaning essentially whatever makes people feel good, whatever pleases them, whatever is arousing. So we've got three different opinions in the Gemara, and then in Shulchan Aruch we saw both in Reish Mem, in Orach Chaim Reish Mem 240, or in Even Ezer 25, we saw the Mechaber, which is Rav Yosef Karo. We saw the Mechaber stating that essentially, which sounds like the Malachi Asharas, or possibly Eva Shalom and Rebbe Lazar. And the more that I think about it, the more that I believe that the Shulchan Aruch was representing the opinion of Eva Shalom, because his entire focus is about kafo shade, which comes from Eva Shalom, and it's an idea of both abstention and abnegation, meaning minimizing lustful interactions, which we're going to have to study more. What does lustful interactions mean? But minimizing lustful interactions, and also this idea of somehow or another that if the sexual act is done in the middle of the night and it's done kaf o shade, as if forced by a demon, there'll be a focus upon each other exclusively. So again, there may be elements of this that are more understandable by us on a practical level and less. So the idea that there should be a focus, and the idea that sexuality in general shouldn't be lustful, there's a lot that we can take with us. The idea that it should be so quick and hurried that neither person should have much pleasure or satisfaction, for us, one would think, just using common sense and knowing the level in which we interact, for us that would seem to be more likely not to produce a bond or a focus on each other, which was, keep in mind, the original goal of Eva Shalom. So we'll have to look at that a little bit later. Then the Ramah, Ramosha Isilis, although he completely endorses and makes a point of saying that as much as one could limit one's pleasure and manage in that way, and we have to discuss, what does managing mean? What would it mean to limit one's pleasure, and what is a possible negative outcome of that, and what's a positive outcome of that, and how does one decide what that is supposed to be? But those are all things that we're going to have to try to figure out. But we have the Ramah, who does say, technically, within the letter of the law, he follows the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, the opinion that the Gemara says the halacha is in accordance, which is basically, like we said, a person can conduct themselves any which way that they feel is sexually pleasurable, as long as it's within the confines of marriage. And he then goes on to discuss a possible distinction between whether or not the zera, whether or not the ejaculation happens through regular sexual intercourse or not. And he even goes as far as to say that some opinions would allow, if it's ba'akroi, if it's done occasionally, for even within the intimacy, the ardor, the romance and passion of sexuality, if it turns out that the ejaculation doesn't happen with sexual intercourse, that might be okay. And we were discussing that's because the idea is to have an act that is non-masturbational. Masturbation, in its essence, is a selfish act. It's taking this power that the Chachamim were all too aware of, and in fact, many religions, respect and understand the power of sexuality and the way in which it should be sublimated and directed in useful ways. So, masturbation is a thwarting of that. It's taking all of that power and all of that drive and desire and not using it to build a family, not using it to create a bond or connection, but simply for self-gratification. And so one might actually look at sexuality on a continuum, where, let's say, the most abhorrent and spiritually toxic version of sexuality is masturbation. And then we can go all the way to the other end and consider, let's say, what was going on between Rebbe Lazar and Eva Shalom, this act of complete devotion and connection to each other. And apparently, at least for them, it would be hard for us to understand that we could do this, but at least for them, this act of intensity and devotion was so powerful, and it was as if they were forced by a demon, that it even occurred relatively quickly and with a great sense of connection to each other and exclusivity. And it was not out of lust, it was out of love. And that is considered, the highest degree and the highest fulfillment of sexuality. So how do we make sense out of all this? Because in reality, the Ramah himself also favors very much and encourages limiting sexual pleasure. So it's almost like saying, well, if you must, such and such is permitted, but really, you should be much higher. And the problem with that is, as we know, the challenges are in correctly applying such a principle, because there's danger in not applying it correctly. There's a discussion. I think it's in Orach Chaim Tafkuf Ayin Dalet or Tafkuf Ayin Hey, I forget, but the place where it discusses fasting, fasting for different purposes, and Talmidei Chachamim and others have different obligations to fast than others. But one of the points that the Nosei Kallah make is that when you're fasting, it's actually in Shulchan Aruch explicitly too, if when you're fasting you lose your temper and you get angry, that's an extremely destructive force, and that can counter the value of the fast itself. And they're talking about not just fasting, but in essence they're talking about any type of self-abnegation or abstention, that the danger in abstaining, the danger in denying our normal physical pleasures is that we will become less functional, whether we'll become tired from fasting, or not be able to focus, or become irritable, or ruin a sense of connection and love and bonding that sexuality creates. The danger of abnegation is breaking and defeating this bond. On the other hand, and this is what clearly the rabbis were acutely aware of, the danger of lustful interactions and the danger of selfish sexuality is equally problematic. And so here you have, like I was describing yesterday, and like we're going to see more, hopefully tomorrow we're going to study the Raavad in depth and also the Geras HaKodesh. But here we have a problem where you've got these two poles, and maybe, as I was suggesting yesterday, that within the unnameable, indescribable oral Torah, where the Torah was never meant to be written down, not because of a technicality, don't write it down, but that it cannot be written down. Even when it's written down, it's not written down because the truest ideas cannot be captured in writing. So we find that the rabbis, and actually many ancient sages, employed the idea of dialectic, the idea of contradiction, in order to contain something bigger within the tension of the two. So by recording within the Talmud, and by recording even within Shulchan Aruch, this idea that you've got this continuum, you have masturbational, lustful sexuality, and you have this extreme self-denial and abstention and abnegation on the other end. What are they really saying? They're saying balance yourself somehow. Balance yourself somehow between these 2 points. And how you balance that, maybe there is no words to describe it. Maybe it cannot be recorded in law, because that is already not genuinely the person. Maybe the idea of the oral Torah is to say that here are the 2 points. Here are the 2 approximate ends that you need to stay away from. Now you need to figure out where you have to be. So you're forcing us, because everybody learns through writing today, and the master-student relationship has been disrupted. So you're forcing us to write down rules. But we really can't write down rules, because writing down rules are no different than taking a living organism, cutting it up and putting it under a microscope. You might be able to study one aspect of it, but you won't see the living organism. The Torah is a living organism. So here we have these 2 ideas: extreme abstention and lustful masturbational sex. And we have technically almost everything is permitted in between. Almost, right? Except for masturbation, almost everything is permitted in between. And what do? What you do is you know these 2 ends, and now you figure out where you need to be. Just like if you're a good driver and you're driving down the highway, you don't bang into the guardrails, right? You don't bang into the guardrails, but you see the guardrails in order to orient yourself, and you figure out where you need to be in that highway. So the guardrails are extremely important, but where you're supposed to be in the middle of the highway, nobody's going to tell you. You need to feel that out for yourself. More to say tomorrow.